Hey, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to the Tie Nose Ball podcast. Thank you so much for your support on the first episode of this. And for today's episode, what I'm going to be doing is my first rendition of a mock draft for this current upcoming NFL draft season. Just to kind of set some ground rules for how this mock draft is going to work, I'm going to be using the draft order as it currently is before the week 16 games going on this week. So this is as of Tuesday, December 16th. And what I'm going to be doing is before I go into any sort of draft, I'm going to predict out some of the moves I think some of these teams might make just to kind of give ourselves a clearer direction of how the draft might go. I'm then going to go through pick by pick and explain why I think it makes sense for each team. I will be doing some trades. I'm not going to, mock a trade for every position within the draft, just the ones that, make an abundant amount of sense. So if you guys like the content that I'm providing, guys, please, feel free to leave a like, subscribe for more, and comment down below what you think. Without further ado, let's get right into it. So going into the draft, guys, I think there's a couple of moves that will be made this offseason. Starting off with the Raiders, I think this is kind of the moment where you look and realize that it might be time for them to move on from Max Crosby. They could have done so at the deadline, decided not to. But ultimately, I think you look at the Raiders' window, where they're kind of expecting to be within the next 2 to 3 years. And I just don't think that they're going to be in a position where having Max Crosby on the team is going to ultimately benefit them. So I think they're going to look to deal him while he still has the maximum amount of trade value. So a team that I would expect to be very interested in a player like Max Crosby, well, pretty much any contending team because he's one of the best edge rushers in football right now. But a team that I think might pursue him a little bit more aggressively than others would be a team like the Dallas Cowboys. So looking at the Cowboys draft capital, they only have one first round pick next year. The reason that it's still on the simulator here is because it's going to be the lower pick between their pick and the Green Bay pick. But overall, they still have two first round selections this year, one next year, and pretty much all their picks. So I don't know if it would take 2 1s to land Max Crosby. Maybe a 1 and a 2. But I think something along those lines would get it done. So I would say they'd probably give up pick 14, and they would be able to give up maybe a round 2 next year, and kind of go from there, for Max Crosby. So that's the first trade that we're going to make, is getting the Cowboys Max Crosby. The second trade we're going to make is going to be with the Bengals, going and getting rid of Trey Hendrickson. At this point, it just seems like it's a whole saga that's not even worth it to them anymore. So I don't think he'll get as much in return as Max Crosby was able to. But a team that I would expect to be very aggressive for him would end up being the New England Patriots, who I could see just giving a first rounder straight up. So we'll do that trade. And then the last trade that I'm going to do for today, guys, is going to be with the Arizona Cardinals. It is going to be Kyler Murray, and I think that they will ultimately move on from him. I think a team that would be the most aggressive towards trading for him would end up being the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, because of his contract and how things work out, I don't think they would have to give up too much for him. So I would say a third round selection would more than likely get it done for Kyler Murray. So now starting the draft, on the clock at number 1, we do have the New York Giants. Now, looking at the Giants' needs, wide receiver is obviously a glaring need. Outside of Malik Neighbors, there's not really much certainty going into next season because Wan'Dale Robinson's no longer under contract, and we don't know if they're going to look to bring him back. Darius Slayton's looking like he's not living up to the $36 million that they paid him last offseason. Could look to try to move off from him this offseason if there's a way that they can get his money off the books. And then just overall, there's no depth really outside of that. So looking at the Giants, receivers definitely something that they could look to target, especially very early in the draft. There's just no way that they would do so with the first overall pick. And given this circumstance with how the board falls, it seems like this would be a prime opportunity to move back with a team that would like to come up and get a quarterback. So I think there's 3 kind of possible scenarios here that the Giants would look to do. Number 1 is just trading with the Raiders, moving back 1 spot. The Raiders picked up that extra first-round pick from Dallas, so they could get aggressive just to secure their quarterback and do something like that where they could, move up just 1 spot, secure their guy, and, kind of live with it since they're going to be selecting another player in the first round anyway. The next team that would make sense is the Jets. They have the haul from both the Dallas trade with Quinnen Williams and the Colts trade, which is looking better and better every day with Sauce Gardner. That Colts pick is probably going to keep getting earlier and earlier at this point, so could either offer some great leverage in a trade or just put them in a prime position to get a really good player. If the Jets were to move up, you also got to remember they have another first-round pick next year. It's either going to be Dallas's or Green Bay's, depending on which pick is earlier. So they have 2 first-round picks this year, 2 second-round picks this year, and then 3 first-round picks next year. So they could definitely afford to be aggressive if they do really like a player. So something that would make sense to me would be something like 5, 37, 46, and, a 1 next year. Just to kind of get the conversation started. Obviously, the Giants could always ask for more given the demand and given how many teams are actually interested, but that would be kind of baseline of where I think the value would kind of start. And then the last team I think that could be aggressive is Arizona, because they obviously just traded away Kyler. So Arizona would probably have to give up the most because there would be 2 teams that they're trying to jump, and the Giants would obviously be coming back the least. So I think the conversation would more than likely end up starting with either 2 firsts and 3 seconds, or 3 firsts and a second, somewhere around there, just based off of the average trade value chart and given the demand at the quarterback position. So overall, just given, this circumstance, it's really tough to kind of navigate this for the Giants because obviously there's uncertainty with what they're going to do with the general manager. I think if they end up keeping Joe Schoen, I think they're really hoping that the Jets are aggressive in wanting to move up because they could offer them the most capital this year. If they decide that, if the Jets decide that they don't want to move up and the Giants, then look to trade down, I'd say the Raiders probably make the most sense because, again, they would get the most capital for this year. They would only move back a spot and gain in a second. I think if they end up moving on from Joe Schoen, the Jets could make sense, but maybe they give up more of, picks in next year's draft, or the Cardinals because they would get more future assets. So for this model, guys, I'm going to predict that Joe Schoen ends up getting fired. I think the Cardinals then become the most aggressive team in trying to trade up. And I think that it would cost something along the lines of 6, 38, 70, a round 1 and a 2 next year, and then maybe something on top of that. But this is what we're going to do to get the conversation started for this mock draft model since we're only doing 1 round anyway. So we're going to force this trade. And now the Cardinals are on the clock at 1. They have their choice of who they would like to take. And to me, Fernando Mendoza just makes the most sense. I think he's, the consensus number 1 quarterback in the draft at this point. Obviously just won the Heisman, playing for a college football title. And so overall, has a lot of tools in the arsenal that I think will allow him to, translate to the next level. I'll go over my kind of breakdown of that in another video, but Fernando Mendoza ends up becoming the first overall pick of the draft. Now, you got to look at the Raiders at number 2. They weren't able to secure the number 1 option in the draft, but they get a pretty good number 2 with Dante Moore. Dante Moore has impressed me more and more each game. I think he could really, really help his stock considering what happens with this playoff year. And, overall, I know there's talks of him potentially going back to school, but with Ty Simpson's fall, I just don't think it really makes sense, especially after what you saw with Drew Aller last year and, the kind of the stock hit that he took. So I think if he has the ability to go top 2, you got to come out, and Dante Moore would be the pick here for the Raiders because the quarterback position is obviously the most important position in football, and you got to figure that out before anything else. So they take Dante Moore here. Now the Titans are on the clock. Titans, they need help all over the place. Overall, Cam Ward has looked pretty good. I know the stats haven't always been there, but if you actually break down the film and look at, the plays and how they kind of break down over everything, he's done pretty much all he could for them. So I think you got a promising, future with him. So you got to build around him. So offensive line makes a lot of sense. I don't really think there's any offensive lineman worth taking this high. So now you kind of look at more of, where else you can kind of patch things up. And I think one of their biggest needs is an edge rusher. And I think Ruben Bain Jr. offers the most upside out of all the edge rushers in this class. And I think it's the kind of pick that you would run to the podium with if you're the Titans. Now, kind of the same deal for the Browns here. Browns, obviously, looking at, the needs that they have. Most of them are on offense. They definitely need to get better on that offensive line. Again, I just don't know if there's anybody worth taking this high. So receiver could definitely be an option because I think when it comes to quarterbacks, no really quarterback worth taking here. I don't think they're aggressive with trying to trade up or anything because I think Shedeur has shown enough to at least give him another year to see, where it kind of lands you there. Considering the fact that 2027 is a much better draft class. So Overall, there's a couple picks here that I think would make a lot of sense. Caleb Downs is going to be somebody you hear me mention for a lot of teams because I think he's the best player in this draft class. I think it's someone that you don't really want to overthink. If you have the opportunity to take a potential all-pro, future Hall of Famer kind of guy, I know positional value doesn't really line up, but I think you just take him regardless. But in this scenario, I don't think they would take him here. I think they would go more for a wide receiver to kind of give Shedeur some compliments here. And I think Carnell Tate is going to end up being the consensus number one receiver off the board, only because Jordan Tyson does have the injury history and because of the physical profile that he would have with his size. And I think that he's going to, skyrocket up draft boards, come this April. So I think Carnell Tate would end up being the first wide receiver taken. Now we move on to the Jets. So the Jets are in a position where they weren't able to get either of the quarterbacks. They have a lot of holes on their roster, and pretty much anybody that they take in this position would be an upgrade. Now, obviously, looking at the board and how it's laid out here, you need wide receivers, you need defensive linemen, you need corner, you need linebacker. Now, considering the fact that they just traded Quinnen and they just traded Sauce Gardner, I don't think they're going to rush to just replace them. I think they'll kind of let value dictate the options there. So I would lean towards one of two options here. I would say they would lean towards either Arvell Reese or Jordan Tyson. Now, with Tyson, obviously his medicals have to check out. If his medicals do check out, I think he could be by far and away the best receiver in this class. But, overall, it's really going to depend on that. Now, I'm just going to go under the assumption that his medicals check out, that the Jets are, willing to take the chance on Jordan Tyson to kind of come in there because worst case scenario, they still have Garrett Wilson. Whereas with the Browns, they kind of need that guy that they can depend on. So I'll take Jordan Tyson here, which kind of leaves a weird scenario for the Giants now because now they've moved back. They've gotten all the assets, but the two wide receivers they would have liked to take are now gone. So they could take Mekhi Lemon, who I think, is going to have a very, very bright future in the NFL. He kind of has the same competitiveness that Amon-Ra St. Brown had coming out of college. And, the reasons why I liked him a lot coming out of the draft a couple years ago. Overall, a little undersized, but he doesn't, play like it. Could definitely be a big asset on anybody's team that he gets drafted to. But ultimately, I think his play style is too similar to Malik Neighbors to where, they're going to create a logjam there. And I don't know if they want to invest another early asset on a receiver when they have so many other needs on the roster. So I'm going to pass on Mekhi Lemon here, and I'm actually going to go with Arvell Reese. Now, I know Arvell Reese is obviously kind of a debate on where he's going to play at the next level. Some people seem to think that he's going to be, more of an edge. Other people think that he's going to be more of an inside linebacker. I think if you're the Giants, you just take good players and you figure out what to do with them. And I think linebacker is the biggest need on the roster for them. So they can start him off as an inside linebacker. If they end up moving on from Kayvon Thibodeau, sometime after the next season or so, whatever, they could always move him onto the edge or, whatever it may be. But I just think the talent is too big. And I think that the need is too big to the point where, they can't really pass up on the opportunity to take arguably one of the best players in this draft. Timeout on the field, please. So before I continue on with the rest of this first round, guys, I could already hear Giants fans in the back of my head yelling at me saying,
"Oh, Ty, you have to give them a receiver because Jackson Dart cannot go into next year throwing the plumbers again."
And I agree with you, right? Like the Giants receiving situation is not great as things stand right now, right? I watched that game against the Commanders and I watched what Jalen Hyatt wasn't able to do. I watched Darius Slayton drop some perfectly thrown passes, right? So I 100% agree that the receiver situation has to improve. But you also have to remember that the Giants just had pick 6 in last year's draft and used that on Malik Neighbors, who will be coming back 100% to start next season, right? So that already is going to upgrade that receiving room. And I know Wan'Dale Robin's a pending free agent, but overall, I trust the receivers that are going to be in the end of round 1 and beginning of round 2 more than I trust the linebackers in the end of round 1 and beginning of round 2. And when you look at why the Giants are losing football games right now, they're losing more games due to what they're not able to do on defense, more than they're losing games due to what they're not able to do on offense. Now, admittedly, Some of that is because of coaching. But also, too, when you look at the linebackers, they already have a very big hole there already. And when you look at what the Giants are going to have to do this offseason, it's probably not going to get any better before this draft, right? They're not in the healthiest cap situation, which means that Bobby Okereke likely becomes a cap casualty due to how much money he's set to make next season. And when you look at the fact that Micah McFadden, who hasn't played at all this year due to an injury, is a pending free agent and might not come back, now you're going into next season with Darius Muasau as your number one linebacker. And that can just not happen, right? The Giants are already the second worst team in the history of football against the run. The only team that has allowed more yards per carry in the history of the NFL is the 1935 Cincinnati Reds. So when you have to go back to pre-World War II to get a stat like that, you know it's very bad, right? So when you're looking at where the Giants are at in this draft, based off of this specific scenario that I'm laying out here, with your wide receiver 1 and 2 already off the board, does it make sense to use another premium pick on someone who might not be, your favorite receiver in the class, might not be that guy that you fall in love with? And if not, then why would you not take one of the two best players in the class within Arvell Reese or Caleb Downs? Right now, maybe the Giants love Mekhi Lemon. Maybe he is their wide receiver 1, and maybe they do run to the podium with this pick. But overall, just given this scenario, I think that Arvell Reese would make a lot more sense for them due to the fact that he can start off as an inside linebacker with them having an abundance of edge rushers already. And then they see fit, they can put him in on the edge on certain downs, right? They can play him at either Sam or Will when they don't want to put him at Mike. Like, he can move around that defense and give them a lot more looks. And I think ultimately that'll help the Giants out more than anything else. Also, another thing to keep in mind, too, is that the Giants do have 2 early second-round picks in this scenario. So if they do want to move up and maybe grab a Denzel Boston, or maybe they do like a Jeremy Bernard or a Chris Brazel or whoever it may be, like, they could also address the receiver 2 position that way as well, right? And also keep in mind that we're basing this off of how things stand right now. Right now, the Giants have the first overall pick, and they're trading down to get the 6. But there's a very realistic chance that the Raiders end up losing to the Giants next week, and the Giants move down from 1 to either 4 or 5, maybe 6 at the most, right? So if that ends up being the case, odds are Jordan Tyson or Carnell Tate would still be on the board, and that might end up being the pick anyway, right? So we're still a long way away from where the draft order is going to actually be set at, but that's what I believe in this specific scenario. So again, hopefully that makes sense to you guys, and hopefully that, saves me from some of the attacks that I know I'll get from some of the Giants fans here. So back to the rest of the draft. So moving on to 7, you have the Saints, who have gone on a little bit of a win streak here. I think Tyler Shuck has kind of shown enough to where they don't need to be aggressive in trying to move up to get a quarterback. So now you kind of look at what else could they do to, kind of build around them. And one of the biggest things that I think they need to do better with is winning in the trenches. Again, not an offensive lineman I would really take here, but Peter Woods is staring me right in the face, and I think that that's somebody that kind of fits that profile of what the Saints look for on defense. Very stereotypical Saints pick, so Peter Woods comes off the board at 7. Now, looking at 8 here, the Commanders, there's a couple things that obviously I look at right away. Number 1 is the fact that they are very old, right? So they need to definitely get a lot more youth on their team. And overall, they just do not have that many draft picks to do so, right? So if you look at their current draft picks, they basically have a first rounder. They do not have a second rounder due to the Laramie Tunsil trade. They have a third rounder. They have basically a fifth, a sixth, and a 7th, right? So overall, they're not in a very good spot draft pick wise. So I think this would definitely be a team that would be primed to move down. So looking at the board, obviously Caleb Downs kind of screams out to me as someone that, could have a team come up to get him. Mekhi Lemon, because of the run on receivers, could definitely be an option. And then a team that wants to move up and grab corner, and Jermon McCoy, just because of the limited options that there's going to be in this early part of the draft. So I think if any team would be primed to move up, it would be somebody like either a Los Angeles Rams or a Kansas City Chiefs to kind of move up and get Caleb Downs. So when you look at the picks available, Kansas City Chiefs, they're sitting there with a couple extra picks, but the Rams obviously have that extra first round pick from the Falcons trade. So I think they could afford to be the most aggressive because they would still be holding on to a first rounder anyway. So I think they could do something along these lines, give a 1 and a 2, just to move up 2 spots. Maybe the Commanders offer, something next year or whatever it may be. But I think they could get very aggressive here. And then they could move up and take arguably the best player in the draft, Caleb Downs. Right now, the Bengals are on the clock. Another team where they have pretty much needs all over the place. I look at the defensive line. I know they just traded away an edge, but they already had a need at edge to begin with, and Trey Hendrickson didn't look like it was going to work out there anyway. So now you look at options like Kendrick Folk, David Bailey, Cassius Howell, and TJ Parker is kind of the top options available. To me, Keldrick Falk reminds me a little of Mikel Williams from last year, where I think he's going to be a little bit more effective against the run on the next level, and is not really as developed as an overall pass rusher. And I think if you look at the PFF grade, it pretty much supports, what I say right there. So overall, I don't think he's necessarily the thing that the Bengals need to look at the most. And I think David Bailey would end up being the more appealing prospect of them just because of his pass rush abilities, right? So I think David Bailey would come off the board here. And then you put Washington back on the clock, only moving down 2 spots, picking up that extra late second rounder. They could pretty much take anything here and it would be an upgrade. Mekhi Lemon would make a lot of sense to give Jaden Daniels another target with the uncertainty of Deebo Samuel. Jermon McCoy would make a lot of sense because they need help in the secondary. Same thing with Mansour Delane, whichever one of your preferences there. They could definitely use a Keldrick Falk, type of player. But to me, I think Sony Styles would end up being the pick here for them just because I think they need someone that can run that mic, someone who can go sideline to sideline and really be the captain of that defense. And I think Sonny Styles is going to end up getting taken a lot earlier than some people are anticipating. So now moving on to the Chiefs, you look at where they're at, and, obviously Mahomes just had his ACL injury, and they're in a tough spot because he might not be ready to, come back until middle, of next season. So you got to look at it and, be smart from a value perspective, which is why I don't think Jeremiah Love makes a lot of sense. I think had Patrick Mahomes been fully healthy and, been good to go for next year, Jeremiah Love would make a lot more sense in this spot. But I think they really need to build up a lot of the rest of this roster because Mahomes kind of hit a lot of their flaws. They definitely could use help on the offensive line. They might need to look for life after Kelsey. And then the defense could obviously use a lot of pieces, especially with what they're going to be losing this offseason. So to me, I think the Chiefs would be in prime position to take someone like Jermon McCoy, because even if he's not ready to go for next year, which he should be because he hasn't played it all this year, but for whatever reason, if he gets set back and he's not able to start, it's not the end of the world because it's not like Mahomes is going to be playing anyway. And I think he's the most talented corner in the draft and the one that definitely has the most upside. So I think it just makes a lot of sense. Now, moving on to the Vikings. I know a lot of people think that Jeremiah Love is, something that, they would run to the podium with, but overall, I think they have more holes than that. I think, that there's going to be some good running backs in this free agency class. There's definitely a couple good options in the middle of the later rounds of this draft, and the value I don't necessarily think lines up to what they need to do. I think they need to get better in that secondary for sure. So I think that they would love to take Jerome McCoy if he's available, but with him going off the board, I think Mansour Delane would kind of start this run on corners here, and, they would go with him. So now you move on to the Dolphins, who have looked a lot better as of late. Obviously, there's some uncertainty with what they're going to do with Tua, Tyreek Hill, and when he's going to come back, what he's going to look like, if he's going to be here, if he's going to be playing somewhere else. They could use help on the offensive line. They definitely need help in the secondary, pretty much anywhere on defense. So I think Sony Styles would have been a pick that they would have loved to have here. He's not on the board. I think they would have loved either of the corners. They're not on the board. So now you kind of start looking at some of these other positions, and to me, Mekhi Lemon just screams like a Mike McDaniel pick. It gives them some flexibility with Tyreek Hill. It allows them to kind of stretch things out vertically, kind of move them around the field, use a chess piece, and overall just seems like something that the Dolphins would ultimately end up doing, and obviously I think that ends up making the most sense. So now you're back with the Raiders on the clock after trading away Max Crosby. They're using this Dallas pick here. They've already gotten Fernando Mendoza earlier on. So now they're going to be looking to potentially upgrade on the rest of the roster here. And I think this is where you start seeing a run on some of the offensive linemen. So I look at someone like Spencer Fano, who's probably the best tackle prospect in this class. Someone that they can move around, either left side or right side because he has history in doing so. Because you see he has snaps at left tackle, he has snaps at right tackle, so he's a little bit more seasoned as a right tackle, which where he would probably play in the next level. But if you needed to move him over, obviously he has a history in doing so, and overall projects to be the top tackle taken. So that's who I would take here. Protect your asset in Fernando Mendoza, and make sure that you're able to build around him. Now the Ravens on the clock here at 15. I think there's a couple different options they could do. They desperately need help on that offensive line, especially in the interior. Daniel, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Falele, whatever it is, looks like one of the worst players in the NFL. I'm not even just on the offensive line, so they could definitely look to, take a mauler there, and that's maybe where Francis Mauga might come off the board. Overall, too, on the defensive line, Keldrick Falk seems like a very stereotypical Ravens draft pick. I don't think Cassius Howe makes sense because I don't think he has the arm length that they need, and Mike Green is already someone that has, limited ability with that. TJ Parker would definitely make sense too. But overall, I think that they would want to upgrade the interior of that offensive line more than anything else, and so that's where I kind of have this pick going. So now moving on to the Panthers at 16, who is having a, up year from where they were the last couple of years. Bryce Young's finally starting to show off a little bit. I think this is, where the run on edges is going to kind of start a little bit. So I believe that Keldrick Falk would fit that profile of what they're looking for. I think that he's somebody that, adds a lot of intensity to that defensive line that they're lacking. And, overall will partner well with Derek Brown and others on that line. So I think that would make the most sense here. Moving on to the Lions. We all know the Lions, they have their own draft board and they don't necessarily listen to anybody else. And overall, the one pick to me that screams Dan Campbell is Caden McDonald. He'll be a perfect person to kind of pair up there with Tyleik Williams to help, kind of anchor the middle of that line, especially in a division with the Packers and the Vikings and the Bears who all love to run the ball, kind of help provide that extra stopgap. So overall, this just screams Dan Campbell to me, and overall a pick that makes sense. Now, the Jets back on the clock at 18 with the Colts pick. They went early in the draft here and took a wide receiver. They passed on quarterback, and overall, with all their assets in 2027 and that being a much better class, I think that trend continues. I think that they're going to end up losing Breece Hall. So as much as, Jeremiah Love would obviously be able to fill that void, I also think that they love the players that they already have on the roster. So because of all the other needs, I don't think Jeremiah Love would come off the board here. So now I start to look at some of the other positions. I look at, corner specifically, and I think Avion Terrell is going to end up coming off the board here. I think he has a lot of good discipline when it comes to how he plays the corner position. I think he plays with some really good instincts, and he should test really well at the combine. So I don't think this is too early for him at all, and it just allows the Jets to have somebody to kind of fill in there on the backside of things where they've been exposed for most of this year. Now we're on to the Buccaneers at 19. And the Buccaneers are in an interesting spot because they have arguably one of the best offensive units in the NFL in terms of talent and, invested assets. And, overall, I believe that they could end up picking a little bit lower than this because obviously they could end up winning that division and, making a little run in the playoffs with the amount of talent that they have. But in this scenario, they're picking here at 19. I think there's a couple different directions they can go. I think Kenyon Sadiq is someone that could definitely be very appealing to them to continue adding to the assets on offense. But ultimately, they have absolutely no pass rush, and they need somebody that could be more of a game changer for them. So I look at both Cassius Howe and I look at TJ Parker. Now, TJ Parker's having a little bit of a down year compared to, where he was at after the 2024 season. Overall, I think he's a little bit more balanced of an edge, whereas Cassius Howe is going to be a little bit more of a liability on the run. And again, I think he just has limited tools in his tool belt. So overall, I think TJ Parker would end up being the pick that would come to make a little bit more sense to me, but I could be convinced either way. Now we look at the Steelers at 20. They made the trade for Kyler Murray with the Cardinals. So now they obviously need to stack talent on the offensive side of the ball. Their defense still plays at a pretty elite level. They could use help in the back end, but overall their offense is depleted of talent and assets. And overall, I think that Denzel Boston just screams Steeler to me. I mean, when you look at his profile, he's 6'4", 209. He plays physical, crisp route runner. Makes contested catches, doesn't drop the ball very often, right? It's just the kind of receiver that Mike Tomlin likes to have in his offense. Could hold down that number one spot, and really fit the profile. So I think that pick makes a lot of sense for them. Moving on to the Eagles at 21. Overall, I think they've been a little bit exposed in the trenches this year. I think injuries have obviously played a huge part of that, but overall, the Eagles' bread and butter has always been winning in the trenches and kind of building off of that. So someone like Ione, who's sitting here at 21, I think is a perfect guard profile for what they would look for. A little bit of a down year, but Penn State's had a complete down year overall. I think he'll project to be a much, much better pro. So I think, to me, the Eagles wanting to win in the trenches, this pick just makes too much sense to me, and that's what I would kind of go to the board with. Now, the Texans are on the clock again, and for them, I think for this entire cycle, we're pretty much going to make one of two picks. We're either going to pick one of the best offensive linemen, or we're going to make Jeremiah Love. Now, this offensive line class is not the best. The Texans have a relatively healthy cap situation, so they could definitely look to throw money there in free agency. So to me, Jeremiah Love just makes a lot of sense because they haven't had really any production out of the running back position, and Jeremiah Love would offer them a lot more consistency and allow CJ Stroud to, take a lot of pressure off him. So Jeremiah Love finally comes off the board here at 22. And now we're sitting here at 23 with Dallas, who retained this pick in the Max Crosby trade. They've addressed the edge position. They could definitely use some linebacker help, some safety help. I think Jeremiah Love would have been a good fit for this spot too, depending on what they end up doing with Williams this offseason. But overall, there's a couple ways that they can go here. I think corner is a sneaky need for them, just because of the uncertainty of the future with Trayvon Diggs. Brandon Sasay is sitting right here, and to me, I mean, his coverage grade isn't as good as we expected it to be, but overall, I mean, 6 foot, 190, fits that profile of what the Dallas Cowboys like to have in their corners on defense. Someone that would, be able to sit behind a good pass rush. So overall, how Dallas is with, picking their players. They like them a certain way, and I think this makes a lot of sense. Now, moving on to the Bills. The Bills, I think, desperately need to add help to Josh Allen on the offensive side of the ball. He needs more playmakers. He can't be Superman every day. I know their defense has been incredibly suspect, but this hero ball that Josh Allen has been playing is not going to be sustainable. And I think Casey Concepcion is just someone that would add a dynamic kind of aspect to their offense that they're severely lacking right now. And I think this is a home run pick for them. Now, looking at the Bears at 25, overall, they are definitely having a great year, compared to where they were at last year. Ben Johnson has looked like he's been able to fix the offense and get it back on track. And, overall, they have a very, very good 1-2 punch on the running back position. They have a good group of core receivers, a good group of core tight ends. Their offensive line has been playing really solid. So overall, I think this pick is going to end up being on the defensive side of the ball. And, specifically, they definitely could use help on the interior of the defensive line. Caleb Banks is, looking at them right here on the board. And to me, just makes a lot of sense for what the Bears are trying to do on defense. Fits the system well, and overall, get good value for where he'd be selected at. Now we look at the Chargers. Being on the clock at 26, we just saw what happened against the Eagles. Justin Herbert was running for his life, and I think this is going to be a team that's pretty much slated to take whatever offensive lineman is going to be on the board. I think they need more help on the interior, especially with, the steadiness of Joe Out and Rashawn Slater. Obviously, I know they've had injuries there, so it's caused the offensive line to shuffle around, but they need some help on the interior. I think Jennings Dunker is going to be someone who ends up moving inside at the NFL level. Just looking at his, size and everything, fits to be more of a guard. And it's someone that they could, kind of plug and play and start right away and fill a giant need. So overall, I have Jennings Dunker coming off the board at 26, making room for the 49ers at pick 27. So obviously they have a whole saga going on with Brandon Ayuk, doesn't look like he's going to be here any longer. They have Juwan Jennings as a free agent this year, and who knows if they're going to re-sign him. So wide receivers definitely become a little bit more of a sneaky need for them. They could also use help on the interior of the offensive line. And then the defense could definitely also use some help as well. They tried to trade for a couple of edge rushers this trade deadline. We're not really able to go out there and land one of the top ones, but they added some nice depth. Nick Bosa should be coming back off of injury next year. They'll have Micah Williams coming off of injury next year. So I don't know if edge is going to be something that they look to slot into them because of the need there. Definitely, if the value lines up, they could look to take them. But overall, wide receiver seems to be the pick that I would think would make the most sense for them. And I think someone like Chris Brazzell is going to be a perfect profile for what they would look for. He could replace the height of Juwan Jennings should he end up moving on. He's a 6'5", 200-pound receiver. Can stretch the field vertically and just offer them a lot of different options in that offense where, Shanahan likes to get his playmakers involved. So now the Browns are back on the clock at 28. Early on in the draft, they were able to go ahead and take Carnell Tate, so they were able to address the receiver position. Now they need to address the offensive line, especially with the pending free agents that they have. I think Caden Proctor is going to fall a little bit. I don't know if he's a first-round pick. I think he's the physical freak that everybody likes in an offensive lineman, being 6'7", almost 400 pounds. But that footwork is just something that's less to be desired. So some of the other options that I would look at here is someone like Caleb Lamu. I think that he has a lot of translatable skills. I don't know if he's somebody that you're going to want to start right away in the next level, but I think he's somebody that if you give him some time to build up, the frame a little bit more and just get a little bit more comfortable within his, rhythm and movement, I think that he could end up being a very fine NFL player. And, with the Browns being on the clock here, I think it's just something that they're willing to take on. So it just makes sense to me in this situation. Now you're moving on to the Bengals at pick 29 here. So earlier on in the draft, we already addressed that they needed interior offensive line, but there was no one worth taking here. Now you've addressed your edge. You're hoping that you're, able to, have a little bit more on that defense with the talent and everything. So now you need to really address this offensive line because Joe Burrow's already kind of hinted that he's tired of getting beat up and they should be tired of him getting beat up. So now there's a couple different options that you could look at. But I think overall the best interior option here is Emmanuel Pregnon out of Oregon. Having a great year playing at left guard for them. Has been an outstanding pass blocker. Has increased his metrics in the run game, which will help out with Chase Brown and everything. Might be a little bit early, but you always see some guards go early here. So overall, I think it makes a lot of sense. It lines up the value and need, and overall, just seems like a very Cincinnati Bengals profile. So moving on to pick 30, you now have the Seattle Seahawks. Obviously, with their offense, it's very centered around the run, so interior offensive line is going to be very important to them. Corner is definitely a sneaky need for them as well because Tariq's going to be a free agent after the year, Tariq Woolen that is, and who knows if they end up bringing him back, because of his up and down play. So I think corner is a sneaky need for them. I think Colton Hood is someone that is going to be a great fit here in the middle to end of round one, and he would be a great fit for this Seahawks defense with the physicality that he brings and the kind of the play style that he has. So overall, that pick makes a lot of sense to me. Now we're looking at the Rams at 31. The Rams are going to be in an interesting spot because they have a lot of pending free agents in the back half of their defense, and they're probably going to be losing Chris Shula. So with that being said, Chris Shula's been able to maximize a lot of the talent that they've had without them having to spend premium assets on it. But there's no guarantee that whoever replaces him will. So I think that, they're going to look at either linebacker or corner here. I think Colton Hood would have been someone they would have loved to have fall to them. He does not in this situation. I don't know if A.J. Harris is worth taking this early. Same thing with Keith Abney. So the names that I kind of look at here, Anthony Hill makes a lot of sense. I think C.J. Allen makes a lot of sense. But ultimately, I think that Chris Johnson ends up being the biggest riser in this class. And I think he ends up going late in round one here. And he goes to the Rams to kind of fill in some of the voids that they're going to end up having this offseason. And then last but not least, you got the Broncos. I think that this is kind of a match made in heaven for what they need on the offensive side of the ball. Evan Ingram hasn't really worked out the way that they wanted to. they're able to just add Kenyon Sadiq and really go through and, add another valuable asset to this offense to help Bo Nix out more going into year 3 next year. So overall, guys, this ends up being the final draft class year. I will download the image and put it on the screen. But this ends up being the final draft class, so you can kind of see it on the screen here and how it all went. Obviously, guys, if you liked this video, please leave a like and comment down below what you thought. Give me some of your feedback on who you would have taken in certain situations over, some of the players that I took. I love having conversations about this kind of stuff. So let me know your opinion and feedback. And until next time, I will see you guys. Peace.